Hello. So I'm just giving a brief little tutorial for everyone on what I know about sharpening knives. And so by no means am I an expert. I've just had a lot of practice, been sharpening most of my life. And so I have some methods, probably some of them are unorthodox and that kind of thing, but I'm a little more freehand than what many people are, but I think I have overall pretty good principles and that type of thing. I'll at least give as a brief rundown of what I know, and hopefully, God willing, it'll help somebody. So, first of all, before we get started with actual anything hands-on, I just want to offer a little bit of information in terms of just the basic principles involved in sharpening, and what specifically what it is to sharpen a knife. So the question came up earlier: what is the difference between making a knife sharp or sharpening the knife and polishing the knife or the blade? And so, in a way, that question really encompasses everything about knife sharpening. And so, when you understand those principles, then you can really understand the stages that are involved in how to sharpen. Okay, so as I'm sure everybody is aware, when you as everyone's preparing to sharpen, you have several stones maybe of different grit, okay, different fineness or different or increasing coarseness. And so the important part of understanding what you're doing whenever you're performing the function of creating an edge is that what you're either doing is removing metal or removing scratches. Okay, and there's a big difference. Okay, so whenever you're on the low grits and you are trying to create that initial edge on the blade, or whether you're starting to straighten the edge or whatever you're doing, you're basically grinding material off of the blade. And so when you have the low, very coarse grits, if you could look at those under a microscope, what you would see are some maybe large, maybe small, but what you would see would be a bunch of particles, all of which have very sharp edges, and they're very hard and they're very sharp, actually sharp enough to actually cut metal. And so when you're moving a blade, say along, and I'm using a longer blade tonight so that this visually it's easier to see. So when you're moving a blade along a very coarse stone, okay, what you're actually doing is you have small particles which are actually digging and cutting small pieces of metal, small little slivers of metal right off of the blade, right? And so you're essentially forming the blade. And so ideally what you're wanting to do is create a straight edge, okay, and then a curve, okay. Now essentially when you're beginning to create your edge, you really just want a single curve. Now this is the way I do it. Some do it a little differently. To me this is way less complex, and to me it's more durable. And so you're creating a single edge, okay? And I create mine because my knives are of really excellent steel, and so they'll hold up to do this. Some people might need to have just a little bit of a wider point, to which they grind. I keep mine fairly low, okay? And you want to grind to a point. And so essentially what you're doing is, and I'm not going to do a whole lot with this knife because to me it's perfect. So I'm going to use a very smooth finishing stone to do most of the demonstration. but imagine this being a very coarse stone. So what I would be doing is I would use water, or some stones use oil, but mine all use water. And you would be actually, creating, doing a grind, and even not pressing hard, but maybe putting just a little pressure down on it. Okay, and then you're going to be spending time just really grinding that edge down to where you want it to be. Okay, and so you're going to do that, and it's going to take many circles. Okay, and so what you want to try to do when you're using a stone is you want to try to utilize as much of that surface area as you want. You don't want to just use a little bit, just a little part of it, because all you'll do is make a divot in your stone, and you won't make as much progress. You'll have to move very quickly over a little area, or you can move nice, slow, steady strokes over a larger area, okay? And you want to be able to cover the entirety of the blade. And so essentially then, once I have made, say, 30 or 40 or 50 or whatever I've decided strokes with this, I turn it over, get to the same angle, and what I do is I try to, you want to maintain the same angle approach on the stone. And so what I try to do is to set my arm. I don't often just keep my arm up like this, because it's hard to maintain an angle. But if I set both my arms and make a solid contact with a table or whatever, okay, then basically I can move everything, okay. And so, or if I even establish a point on my own side where I'm keeping my elbow, then I can maintain a very consistent angle to the stone. Okay, and so it allows me to continue to just cover the entire blade as I'm grinding. Okay, and then after I've done my 20 or 30 or 40 or 50 or however many I've decided to do, I check my blade, see if it's beginning to take the edge, something of an edge like I might want. Okay, then what I do is I take my blade and I will kind of go long ways like this, and so it creates just a very consistent scratch pattern on the edge of the blade. Okay, so that you don't have a very light scratch pattern, maybe in one area of the blade, and then down here in another area of the blade have a coarser. And so what this does is it kind of evens it out, so it all is kind of the same. And then I'll turn it over. Of course, I'm holding. I don't keep my stones flat on the table. For many people starting out, that's probably the best thing to do. For me, I hold my hand flat. I can hold and then I keep my fingers out of the way, and it's easier for me to just go freehand with it, and I can do that, and because I have practice, I can maintain a good angle. Okay, but basically, you're making an even scratch pattern on the entire blade, so that you've cut out an even amount of an exact common amount of metal out of each edge of the blade. And so essentially it's very simple. Then you just go from the coarsest grit that you would start with, usually, unless I really have some big problem with the blade, I never use anything really below a 400 grit, unless I have to have a big nick or something like that I've got to take out. But even using 400 is fairly rare. I don't use it, don't use that often. But I would go so from 400 to 800, okay, and so once again with 800, I'm going to be now. I have the particles in the stone are similar to the 400, except that they're a little smaller, and they're still very sharp, but they're small enough that now they're still cutting a little bit, but they're making the scratch pattern smaller. They're making the grooves now that they're cutting are not as deep, and now you're kind of taking away all of the grooves, the highs and lows that you created in the lower grit. And so now we're grinding it down a little more, grinding the big hills and valleys out that we've scratched on it with the very coarse grit, and we're taking some more of those out. Okay, so so by the time we get to around 800, we've pretty much you want to have accomplished everything you're going to accomplish in terms of making your angle on your blade. And so essentially, when you start to feel your blade and that kind of thing, you'll want to check for Peggy Mote, check for any kind of snags, anything like that. You might want to go back and touch up some areas, maybe focus in on like one spot somewhere that might need a little something or whatever. But you want to get your blade feeling pretty smooth, and you want to have a good sense of sharpness on it. But it's not going to feel sharp. It's not going to cut well or anything like that. You just want to feel that it has the beginnings of a good edge, and that just comes by experience. You're just going to have to spend some time doing it, and you'll begin to get a feel for what that really means. So by the time we get to around 1,000 grit, somewhere like that, we've gone past cutting and taking away metal. Okay, now what we have are the rest of our stones have a grit pattern that is much smaller, much finer, and all it's really doing, it's no longer really, I won't say it's not taking away any steel, but what it's taking away is just, if you could look at it with a microscope, you would still see, from your lower grits, you would still see a very rough pattern in it, a lot of jaggedness, even though you can't see it with your eye, you can't necessarily feel it with your finger. If you can know and sense that it's still not as sharp as it needs to be, you know that the reason why is those microscopic little jagged edges and hills and valleys in there that you still need to smooth out. And so now you are beginning to simply move around a little metal, take some highs and lows out, that kind of thing. You're not shaping the steel anymore. Now all you're doing is removing the highs and low valleys on a microscopic level until that begins to smooth out and become a very, very flat plane. And so essentially then you're just working your way down from one to another. That's a little lighter grit and lighter grit till you get to a point where you're beginning now to realize that, hey, I'm beginning to feel like if I get to 1,000, now I'm at say I'm here at a 2,000, okay, then I'll begin to realize, okay, now I'm beginning to really feel some sharpness here. It's starting to really feel like it's starting to come around, starting to really be what it needs to be, okay? And so now when that begins to happen, we stop applying pressure. All we're doing is lightly rubbing, okay? We're doing all the same motions, okay? We're just doing it nice and gentle, nice and light, and getting those highs and lows out of there, beginning to smooth out the surface of that blade. And so as we keep going down, say once we get to like what will be my Blackstone, sometimes I'll do it at my 5,000 grit, but if I'm doing my normal just touching up my blades, okay, I'll be doing everything at a pretty low angle, okay. And now once I begin to get a feel for, okay, this is my blades, I don't have any Peggy Mote, everything is feeling pretty good. I look down the blade, there's no waves, everything is good. I don't have to go down to any step down a grit or two or anything like that to resolve any problems. If you do have problems, then now's the time to get them out. You go back down, maybe 1 step or 2 steps, and if you wind up now, as you begin to smooth the blade out, then suddenly you'll begin to, as you're checking for a peggy mote, you'll begin able to, feel some that you could not feel before, because the rest of the blade is starting to become more and more smooth, and now suddenly, you'll feel something there that maybe you weren't able to feel before, because the grit pattern on your steel was still too rough to be able to feel it. And so you might have to then step down, maybe in this area, do a little bit more at a lower grit, then work that area back up again, and smooth it out, check it again, make sure it's gone. And so before you get into, getting too smooth, say around 1,000 to 2,000 grit is where you want to really spend most of your time checking for your peggy mote, okay? And then stepping back down, bringing it back up, stepping back down, bringing it back up. Every time checking to see what flaw in the blade you could feel now that you didn't feel before. And so then when you step up to the 5,000 or to the Blackstone or something like that, it'll be the same thing. You'll want to stay flat, okay, and go through your entire pattern, however many circles. So if you go, say, 20 or 30 on this side, go 20 or 30 on this side, flip it, go the length, go a very long stroke, the length of the blade, turn it back over, the length of the blade, get that scratch pattern out, check it, okay? At some point, then, when you're getting into your upper grits, you'll want to actually drag the blade a little bit backwards, okay? And that will begin to take like some little burrs and that kind of thing that maybe you didn't know you had, and it'll begin to bring them back over and that kind of thing, and you'll be able to start to deal with them. You might have to step down again another grit or two, get some of that out. But at some point then you'll begin, okay, you're maintaining your original angle, okay, and you'll begin to feel, okay, now I'm starting to really feel like this is starting to, have some real keenness, some real sharpness to it. It's at that time that then you'll want to take and you want to begin to just very slightly, if you've been, whatever angle you've been at, okay, which this would be about my normal angle that I do most of my sharpening at, which once again, that's a lower angle than most people use. Most people will use something a little bigger than that, but I don't. So I stay nice low angle. And then once I've realized, okay, I'm finishing up, I have no more peggy mote, everything, all of that is worked out. Now it's time to make this thing very, very sharp, very keen. Then what I'll do is I'll raise up my angle just a little bit, okay? Not very much, because if you do very much, then all the progress you'll made, you will just mash it back off with the stone. So I just raise it a few degrees, and what that does then is when I have my point that I have ground to, and now I've been polishing that point and making it very, very, very high polished, and so making some sharpness there. What that does is right at the very tip, right at the very edge of it, it actually makes just another tiny little, maybe not so steep of an edge, okay? Or it takes that very edge and it begins to very highly polish it, okay? And so it's something that's really not visible to the eye, but you're no longer polishing the entire width that you've been polishing. Say that little bit that you've been polishing, grinding and polishing on the edge of your blade, now you're taking that down to maybe 10 or 20% of that little bit. That's what you're focused on. And so now you begin to just go through all the same motions, do all the same things, however many times, but you're good, and you're applying no pressure. Everything is very light, very gentle, very easy, And then you'll begin, as you continue to do that, you just want to keep going and going and going, checking your blade, and seeing, okay, am I getting really truly sharp or not? And so essentially for me, whenever my test is again with my fingernail and with my flesh, but I use my flesh when I'm sharpening a little differently than I would when I'm checking the edge of the blade in order to check. So, I've felt, yes, I've got no pigment, everything is very nice and smooth, okay? But now, what I'll do, I don't go slicing into my finger, but what I do is I look at the tip of my finger for my fingerprint, okay? And basically, I can take my fingerprint and with almost no pressure, don't put pressure on it, you'll cut yourself. But I can actually just begin to take just a little, very, very gentle, and literally, I'm lifting my fingerprint. I'm actually not, that very first top layer of skin, I'm actually able to literally take my fingerprint right off with that. Now, I don't cut it out right off. I just, realize that just a very light, not even amount of press, but actually just touching the blade and making just a millimeter or less of motion actually the blade begins to immediately cut right into my fingerprint. And so that I know that it's really reached a very high level of keenness. And so essentially, that's what I do. I think that's a pretty short and sweet rundown of the basics of how to do it. If you really want me to kind of show you some of the motions and that kind of thing, I can do that. Maybe I'll do that really quickly here. Now here's something that I have. I don't know if any of you have any of these. Maybe some do and that kind of thing. But this is especially for guys that are beginning. This is a really nice little device to have. If you don't have the confidence to just hold the stone in your hand, which I wouldn't at first, you know what I'm saying? Because your tendency is to have your tips sticking over top and man, you slice your fingertip right off. But I've learned over years and losing a couple fingertips, is that how to hold it with keeping your fingers well below the edge and that kind of thing. So lots of practice of that. It's second nature to me, but I don't recommend that starting out. So most guys wanted to start with it on the table, on a flat surface or something like that. But then when you're working on a flat surface, it can be very difficult because you're running into the table, that kind of thing. And to have one of these little guys is really nice because you set the stone right in it, a couple little screws here that screw it down. This is rubber, hard rubber, like kind of like a hockey puck. And so then that raises it up. That gets it, that makes it probably almost 2.5 times as tall as just the stone itself is. And so now, a person can now very easily, you're not running into the table or anything like that. Your hands can very easily pass over it and you can make all the motions you need. It's staying very still. Now you can focus on keeping your arm where it needs to be, keeping it in a fixed location, not letting your elbow move around a lot, but keep everything pretty even and straight. It's actually, you're more stable if you rock your body than you are if you move your arm. And so for me, it's just a little bit of a Hasidic davening motion. So it's a nice device to use. They're not a lot of money. They're maybe $35 or $40 or something like that at any of the supply places that you buy the stones. And so they're pretty handy for that, if you're getting started with it. So anyway, that's I guess I'll end it there. If you have any questions or anything like that, feel free to contact me. Like I said, I'm I'm not making myself out to be, something I'm not, or any kind of big expert or anything like that. It just happens to be that I've have at this point I've experienced 2 or 3 different lifetimes of doing different things, and all along the way, sharpening blades has been some integral part of that. So I've just done a lot of it in my life and that kind of thing. So I've never had really any formal training. I don't get, I don't know if I'm better than anyone else or not at it. I really don't. But I do have some practice at it, and so I seem to be able to make a blade pretty adequately sharp. So I'm happy to share whatever it is that I think I know, and so we'll leave it at that. So thanks, and we'll talk later.